The cage door snapped open before anyone could stop it, and the small wolf cub shot out like an arrow released from a bow. Guards scattered in every direction, boots skidding across the stone courtyard, hands grabbing at empty air. The cub was fast, faster than anything his size should have been, and every time a guard closed a fist around him, he twisted free and left a line of scratches behind as payment. Elira Vance stood pressed against the far wall with the other servants, her arms wrapped around a basket of laundry she had forgotten she was still holding. She could not look away from the cub. His fur was matted with dirt, his ribs pressed too tightly against his skin, and his eyes held something no ordinary animal should carry. Fear, yes, but underneath the fear was something sharper. Recognition, rage, grief. A guard named Bastion lunged for the cub and caught his back leg. The cub twisted his whole body around and sank his teeth into the man's wrist. Bastion howled and let go, and the cub tumbled across the stones, rolled once, and came up snarling with his hackles raised so high he looked twice his real size. "Get nets," someone shouted from the gatehouse. "Get the iron nets before he reaches the outer wall." Elira's stomach twisted at those words. Iron nets meant burns. Iron nets meant a small body thrashing against metal that would sear his skin the moment he tried to shift or fight back. She took one step forward without deciding to, and a hand caught her elbow. "Don't," whispered Leora, the healer's assistant standing beside her. "You'll get trampled. Let the guards handle it." "They're going to hurt him," Elira said quietly. "He bit 3 men already. What do you expect them to do? Invite him to supper?" Elira didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the cub, who had backed himself into a corner between 2 stacked crates, chest heaving, teeth bared at 4 guards closing in with a length of chain stretched between them. He looked so small in that corner, so alone. She had seen that exact posture before, on a night she tried very hard never to remember, and the memory rose up in her chest like smoke finding a crack in a wall. More guards poured into the courtyard, drawn by the noise. Word had already reached the North Tower, and servants leaned out of windows to watch, murmuring to each other, placing quiet bets on how long the little beast could hold out against a fortress full of trained soldiers. Nobody expected it to take long. Nobody expected what came next. The chain net dropped over the cub, and for one terrible moment, Elira thought it was over. Then the cub twisted underneath it with a speed that defied his size, slipped through a gap no wider than a fist, and came out running low and fast toward the open archway that led to the training yard. Guards dove for him and missed. One man's fingers brushed his tail and came away with nothing but air. "He's heading for the east gate," Bastion shouted, cradling his bleeding wrist against his chest. "Cut him off before he reaches the stables. If he gets loose in the city, we'll never find him again." 6 guards sprinted for the east gate. The cub read the movement instantly, planted his paws, and reversed direction so sharply that 2 guards collided with each other trying to follow. A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the watching servants, quickly smothered when Bastion turned a furious glare on the gallery above. Elira's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had told herself, when she first arrived at Blackthorn Keep 3 months ago, that she would keep her head down. She would carry laundry, empty ash bins, and stay so quiet and so unremarkable that nobody would ever think to ask where she came from, or why an Omega with her particular skills was working as a common maid in a fortress that belonged to the most powerful Alpha Pack in the Northern Territories. She had kept that promise to herself for 3 months. She felt it cracking now, the way ice cracks under weight it was never meant to hold. The cub darted between the legs of a guard, spun around a water trough, and nearly made it to the shadow of the stable wall before a rope caught around his back leg and yanked him off his feet. He hit the ground hard and let out a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a cry, something raw and wordless that made every servant in the courtyard go still. "Got him," the guard holding the rope shouted, already hauling the line in hand over hand. "Bring the collar." The cub twisted onto his back, snapping at the rope with his small teeth, trying to bite through braided hemp that would not give. Another guard approached with a heavy iron collar meant for a full-grown wolf, 3 times the cub's size, and Elira felt the basket of laundry slip from her arms and hit the ground unnoticed. That was the moment the courtyard gates at the far end swung open, and a hush moved through the crowd faster than any shout could have traveled. Servants dropped to half bows. Guards straightened their spines, even as they kept their hands on the struggling cub. Elira turned, along with everyone else, toward the source of that sudden silence, and found herself looking at Alpha King Draven Ashford walking into the courtyard with the unhurried, dangerous calm of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush. He was tall in a way that made the doorway behind him look smaller, dressed in the plain dark clothing he favored when he wasn't holding court, and his eyes swept the chaos in front of him, with the flat assessment of a commander, counting losses after a battle. He said nothing yet. He didn't need to. The guards holding the rope froze mid-motion, suddenly aware of how they must look, a dozen trained soldiers struggling to subdue one starving cub. "Explain," Draven said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Bastion stepped forward, still pressing a cloth against his bleeding wrist. "My king, the cub broke free from the northern holding pen 20 minutes ago. We've tried nets, ropes, everything short of force enough to hurt him. He won't be caught." "He appears to have been caught," Draven observed, glancing at the rope around the cub's leg. As if the cub had understood the words as a challenge, he twisted hard against the rope, planted his back paws against the ground, and pulled with a strength that made the guard holding the other end stumble forward 2 full steps. The rope frayed audibly where his teeth had worried at it, and with one final violent wrench, it snapped. The courtyard erupted into motion again. The cub scrambled free, shot between 2 more guards, and this time made it all the way to the base of the old stone well at the courtyard's center, before anyone could close the distance. He turned there, back pressed against cold stone, and faced the entire assembled might of Blackthorn Keep, with his teeth bared and his small body trembling, not with fear alone anymore, but with something that looked disturbingly like defiance. Draven's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened as he studied the cub more closely. There was fresh interest there now, the kind a king rarely showed for anything as small as a wayward pup. He took a single step forward, and every guard in the courtyard instinctively drew back to give him room. "Bring him to me," Draven said. 2 guards approached the well with slow, careful movements, hands out, voices pitched low in the soothing tones one might use on a spooked horse. The cub watched them come with wide, wild eyes, his small chest heaving, and when the nearest guard reached out a hand, the cub let out a sound of pure panic and lunged, teeth finding flesh again, before scrambling up and over the lip of the well itself, balancing on the narrow stone rim, with nothing beneath him but a long drop into darkness. A collective gasp rose from the watching crowd. Elira's hand flew to her mouth. If the cub lost his footing there, if he panicked one moment too long, there would be nothing anyone could do to save him. "Stand back," Draven ordered sharply, and every guard obeyed instantly, retreating 3 full steps from the well. He studied the cub balanced on that narrow rim, his growl thin and exhausted now, his legs visibly shaking beneath him, and for the first time since entering the courtyard, the Alpha King's composure showed the faintest crack of something that might have been concern. "He's going to fall," Leora whispered beside Elira, her voice tight with horror. Elira could not stay silent any longer. Whatever careful plan she had built for herself over 3 months of hiding, whatever promise she had made to keep her head down and her past buried, all of it dissolved in the face of watching that small, starving, terrified creature balance on the edge of a stone well, with an entire fortress staring at him like a curiosity to be captured, rather than a life to be saved. She stepped out from the crowd before Leora could stop her a second time. "Wait," Elira called out, her voice carrying further across the courtyard than she expected. Every head turned toward her, including, worst of all, the king's. A guard moved to intercept her, but Draven raised one hand, and the guard stopped mid-stride. The king's gaze settled on Elira with an intensity that made her knees want to fold, but she forced herself to keep walking forward, slow and steady, the way she had once been taught to approach a frightened animal without triggering the instinct to run. "You have something to say to me," Draven said. It was not quite a question. Elira dropped into a bow, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the whole courtyard could hear it. "Forgive me, my king. I only meant that shouting and force will not calm him. He is too frightened to understand commands right now. He needs quiet." "And you know this how?" Draven's tone carried no accusation, only genuine curiosity, but the weight of his attention still felt like standing too close to a fire. Elira hesitated. Every instinct she had built over 3 months screamed at her to invent a safe, forgettable answer and retreat back into the crowd where she belonged. But the cub's legs were shaking harder now, his balance failing by degrees, and she did not have time for careful lies. "Because I have worked with frightened cubs before, my king," she said, which was true, and also nowhere near the whole truth. Draven studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the weight of his gaze pressing against her skin like a physical thing. Then he glanced back at the cub, whose grip on the stone rim was slipping visibly now, one paw sliding off the edge before he scrambled to catch himself again. "Then help him," Draven said, "now, before he falls." Elira did not wait to be told twice. She moved toward the well with slow, deliberate steps, keeping her body low and her hands visible, exactly as she had once been taught by someone she tried very hard not to think about anymore. The cub's wild eyes locked onto her, and for a moment she feared he would panic further and lose his grip entirely. But something in the cub's frantic gaze shifted as she drew closer. His nostrils flared, catching some thread of scent beneath the smell of fear and stone dust, and his growling faltered into something quieter, more uncertain. Elira felt every eye in the courtyard on her back, felt the king's attention like a physical weight, and beneath all of it, felt the old memory rising in her chest, sharp and clear as the day it happened. She thought of a small burning house, a mother's voice calling a name through smoke, and a cub, not much older than this one, clinging to a windowsill with nowhere left to run. She stopped 3 steps from the well, close enough now to see the fine tremor running through the cub's entire body, close enough to see that beneath the dirt and the fear, his eyes were an unusual shade of pale gold, the kind of color she had only ever seen in one bloodline in her entire life. Her breath caught in her throat. "Easy," she murmured, so softly that only the cub and perhaps the closest guards could hear her. "Easy now. Nobody here is going to hurt you. I promise you that." The cub's growl thinned into a whine, his small body torn between the urge to flee and something else, some instinct pulling him toward the sound of her voice, instead of away from it. Elira took another slow step closer, her hand extended, palm open and empty, exactly as she had been taught. Behind her, Draven watched in absolute silence, his sharp eyes tracking every movement, every shift in the cub's stance, every flicker of recognition that seemed to pass between the trembling animal and the quiet Omega, who had stepped forward, when none of his trained soldiers could manage what she was attempting now, with nothing but a soft voice and an open hand. The cub's front paws slipped another inch on the wet stone rim of the well, and a sharp gasp went through the crowd. Elira did not hesitate. She said the one word that rose to her lips before she could stop it, before she could think about what saying it out loud, in front of the Alpha King and his entire court, might mean for the careful hidden life she had built for herself over 3 long months of silence. She said his name. The cub froze instantly, every muscle in his small body locking still, his wild eyes going wide with something that looked almost like disbelief. The growling stopped entirely. The trembling stopped. For one suspended heartbeat, the only sound in the entire courtyard was the low whistle of wind through the stone archways, and the cub stared at Elira as though she had reached into the darkest, most desperate corner of his memory and pulled out the one thing he had never expected to hear again. Then, slowly, carefully, the cub climbed down off the narrow stone rim of the well and walked toward her on unsteady legs, and the entire fortress of Blackthorn Keep watched in stunned silence as the small, wild, unbreakable creature that had defeated a dozen trained guards pressed himself against the legs of a servant girl and finally, went still. Alpha King Draven Ashford did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched, his sharp gaze fixed on the Omega kneeling in the courtyard dust, with a starving cub curled trembling against her, and understood, with the certainty of a man who had spent his entire life reading danger before it arrived, that something important had just begun. Something that would not end quietly, no matter how much either of them might wish it could. Nobody in the courtyard moved for a long moment. The guards, who had spent 20 minutes chasing a single starving cub around the fortress, now stood frozen in a wide circle, staring at the sight of him pressed silent and trembling against a servant they barely recognized. Bastian lowered his bleeding wrist and stared, as though he had witnessed something closer to sorcery than comfort. Draven crossed the distance between himself and the well, with slow, measured steps, his boots silent against the stone, He stopped an arm's length from Alira and the cub, close enough that she felt the shift in the air around him, the particular pressure that came from standing near an alpha of his rank. She kept her eyes down, one hand resting lightly on the cub's matted fur, and waited for whatever judgment was about to fall. "What did you say to him?" Draven asked. His voice was quiet now, stripped of the command it had carried moments before, replaced with something closer to genuine wonder. Alira lifted her eyes just enough to meet his, then lowered them again immediately, remembering herself. "A name, my king, nothing more." A name he recognized. It was not a question, and Alira did not pretend otherwise. It would seem so. Draven studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his gaze moving from her face to the cub curled against her knees and back again, searching for something he could not quite name yet. Around them, the guards began to shift uneasily, unsure whether to stand at attention or retreat, unsure whether the crisis had truly ended or simply changed shape. "Bring them both inside," Draven said finally, straightening and turning toward the main hall without waiting to see whether his order would be obeyed. "The girl and the cub, my private study, now." Two guards moved to escort Alira, their hands hovering near her shoulders without quite touching her, the way one might guide someone whose behavior had suddenly become unpredictable and possibly dangerous. Alira rose carefully, keeping one arm curved protectively around the cub, who allowed himself to be lifted against her chest without a single sound of protest, his small body still trembling with exhaustion. Leora caught her eye as she passed through the crowd of watching servants, her expression a mixture of worry and something close to awe. Alira offered her the faintest shake of her head, a silent warning not to ask questions yet, and kept walking. The walk through the halls of Blackthorn Keep felt longer than it should have. Alira had spent 3 months learning every servant's corridor and hidden passage in this fortress, had memorized which floorboards creaked and which doors stuck in the cold, all so she could move through the keep unnoticed. Now she walked openly through the main halls, flanked by guards, carrying a cub whose existence she was fairly certain the entire pack had been arguing about for days, and every set of eyes she passed followed her with open curiosity. The cub pressed his face against her shoulder as they walked, his small body shivering, and Alira found herself murmuring quiet, meaningless comfort to him, the same soft nonsense she remembered someone once murmuring to her, a lifetime ago, before everything had burned. Draven's private study was nothing like she expected. She had imagined something cold and imposing, all iron and stone and trophies of past conquests, but instead she found a room lined with books, a low fire burning in the hearth, and a single wide window looking out over the northern hills. It felt, disconcertingly, like a place a man came to think, rather than a place a king came to rule. "Sit," Draven said, gesturing to a chair near the fire, though his tone made it clear this was not truly a request. Alira sat, the cub curling immediately into her lap, and watched as the king closed the study door himself, dismissing the guards who had escorted her with a short, sharp gesture. For a moment, he said nothing at all. He simply stood near the window with his back to her, his broad shoulders tense beneath the plain dark fabric of his shirt, and Alira found herself studying the line of his profile against the fading afternoon light, wondering, despite everything, what thoughts moved behind that carefully composed expression. 3 months ago, Draven said finally, still facing the window, a scout patrol found this cub alone in the Ashgrove ruins, half-starved, feral, and unwilling to shift or speak a single word to anyone who approached him. My healers could find nothing wrong with his body, that food and rest would not eventually mend. But his mind, they told me, was somewhere else entirely, locked away from anything or anyone who tried to reach him. Alira's arms tightened instinctively around the small, sleeping form curled in her lap. She had wondered, in the vague and frightened way one wonders about things too painful to examine directly, what had become of him after that night. She had told herself she would never know, that it was safer not to know, that some doors were better left closed even when the not knowing ate at her in the quiet hours before dawn. He has bitten every healer, every guard, and every servant who has tried to approach him in the 3 months since, Draven continued, finally turning to face her. He has refused food unless it was left alone in his pen. He has torn apart 3 separate holding enclosures. My advisors wanted him destroyed weeks ago, as a mercy, they said, since a feral wolf who cannot be reasoned with poses a danger to the entire keep. Alira's stomach lurched violently at the word destroyed, and something in her expression must have given away exactly how much that possibility horrified her, because Draven's sharp eyes narrowed, studying her with fresh intensity. "I refused their counsel," he said. "I could not say why, exactly, except that something about him felt worth protecting, even when every reasonable argument suggested otherwise. Now, I find myself standing in my own study, watching a servant I have never once noticed in 3 months calm him with a single word, and I find myself asking a question I suspect you do not wish to answer." Alira's throat had gone dry. "My king, I only—" "Who is he?" Draven interrupted, his voice quiet but absolutely unyielding, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than any shout. "And who, exactly, are you?" The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed. Alira looked down at the cub sleeping in her lap, his small chest rising and falling in slow, exhausted breaths, his pale gold eyes hidden now beneath closed lids, and felt the careful walls she had built around herself over 3 long months of hiding begin to crumble under the weight of a question she had been dreading since the moment she first crossed the borders of Blackthorn territory. "His name is Kale," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And once, a very long time ago, I was the one who was supposed to protect him." Draven's expression shifted at that, something unreadable passing behind his sharp eyes, and he crossed the room slowly to sit in the chair opposite her, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that she understood, with sudden clarity, that there would be no retreating from this conversation, no vague half-truths that would satisfy a man who had built his entire reign on reading exactly what people were trying to hide from him. "Then start from the beginning," Draven said, "and do not leave anything out." Alira closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself, feeling the weight of a memory she had spent 3 months trying to bury under laundry baskets, and empty corridors, and careful, deliberate silence. When she opened them again, she found the king watching her with an expression she had not expected from him, something that looked almost like patience, almost like a willingness to listen rather than simply judge. "It began 4 years ago," she said slowly, "in a pack most people in this territory have never even heard of, on a night that ended everything I once knew." Outside the study window, the sun continued its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red, and somewhere deep in the fortress below, word was already spreading among the servants and guards of Blackthorn Keep that the king had shut himself away with a mysterious Omega, and the feral cub nobody else could tame, and that whatever story was unfolding behind that closed study door was one that would change the shape of the entire pack before it was finished. 4 years ago, Alira had lived in a small pack called Wren Hollow, tucked into a valley so far from the great territories that most maps did not bother to mark it. Her family had served as caretakers to the pack's ruling bloodline for 3 generations, and by the time Alira turned 19, that duty had passed to her. She had been given charge of the youngest member of the ruling family, a cub barely past his first year, with pale gold eyes that marked him instantly as a descendant of the old line, a bloodline said to carry a rare and dangerous strength that had not surfaced in generations. His name was Kale, and Alira had loved him the way one loves a small brother, fiercely and without condition, from the very first week she held him. Wren Hollow was not a large pack, nor a wealthy one, but it was peaceful, and its people took quiet pride in a history that stretched back further than most of the great territories could claim. Kale's mother, Isolde, ruled the pack with a gentleness that some outsiders mistook for weakness, though anyone who had seen her defend her borders knew better. Alira spent her days in the nursery wing of the old stone hall, teaching Kale his first words, catching him when he stumbled during his earliest attempts to run, and singing him to sleep on nights when nightmares chased him awake. She remembered, with painful clarity, the night everything changed. It began with smoke. Alira woke to the smell of it curling under her bedroom door, thick and acrid, and by the time she reached the nursery, the entire east wing of the hall was already burning. She found Kale standing in his crib, screaming, his small hands reaching for her through the smoke, and she scooped him up without a single thought for anything else in the world. The attack, she learned later, had come from a rival faction within their own territory, a group of ambitious wolves who had long resented Isolde's gentle rule and saw an opportunity, in the chaos of a poorly defended night, to seize control of Ren Hollow's ancestral bloodline for themselves. They wanted Kale specifically, not for his own sake, but for the rare strength his pale gold eyes promised he would grow into, a strength that could be bent to serve whoever controlled him. Alira ran with Kale pressed against her chest, through corridors thick with smoke, past guards fighting losing battles against attackers who had planned this night for months. She remembered Isolde's voice somewhere behind her, shouting for her to run and not look back, remembered the particular note of desperate love in that voice, the kind only a mother facing the last moments of her own life could summon. She never saw Isolde again. Alira made it out of the burning hall, through a servant's passage she had discovered years earlier, while exploring as a child, Kale, screaming against her shoulder the entire way. She ran until her legs gave out, hid in the forest for 2 days surviving on nothing but rainwater and stubbornness, and eventually found her way to a small border town where she traded the only valuable thing she still carried, a silver pendant that had belonged to her mother, for enough coin to keep herself and Kale fed for a few weeks. For 6 months after that, she and Kale lived as fugitives, moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough for anyone to ask too many questions about the quiet young woman traveling alone with a small child, who flinched violently at loud noises, and refused to sleep unless someone was holding him. She had done everything she could to protect him. She had told herself, over and over, that as long as she kept moving, as long as she kept him hidden, the people who had destroyed Ren Hollow would never find them, and Kale would grow up safe, even if he never grew up knowing the truth of who he really was. But 6 months into their flight, in a border town whose name Alira still could not bring herself to say out loud, they had been found. She remembered very little of what happened that night with any clarity, only fragments. Men breaking through the door of the small room they had been renting above a tavern. Kale screaming her name as hands tore him from her arms. A blow to her head that sent the entire world sideways, and darkness swallowing everything that came after. When she woke, 3 days later, in the care of a traveling healer, who had found her half dead in an alley behind the tavern, Kale was gone. She had spent the following 3.5 years searching for him in every way she knew how, chasing rumors through a dozen territories, working whatever jobs would let her stay near the roads and the borders where information traveled fastest, always listening for any whisper of a pale, gold-eyed cub being kept somewhere against his will. She had heard nothing solid, nothing real, only enough scattered rumors to keep the smallest, most stubborn flame of hope alive in her chest. 3 months ago, that flame had finally caught real fuel. A trader passing through the town where she had been working as a healer's assistant mentioned, in passing conversation about nothing important, that Blackthorn Keep scouts had found a feral wild cub abandoned in the Ash Grove ruins, a cub with strange pale gold eyes that none of the healers there could explain. Alira had left that town within the day, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and every coin she had managed to save, and had talked her way into a servant's position at Blackthorn Keep within a week of arriving, using a false name and a carefully rehearsed story about fleeing an arranged mating she did not want. She had spent 3 months since then trying to find a way close enough to the cub's holding pen to confirm what she already suspected in her bones, terrified that if she moved too quickly, if she drew even a moment's suspicion, she would lose whatever fragile chance she had to reach him. She had never expected the chance to arrive the way it had, in a chaotic courtyard with a dozen guards and the Alpha King himself watching her every move. By the time Alira finished speaking, the fire in Draven's study had burned low, and the room had gone dark enough that only the faint orange glow of embers and the last thin light through the window illuminated the space between them. Draven had not interrupted her once during the telling. He sat perfectly still, his sharp eyes fixed on her face, absorbing every word with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly how much it must have cost her to speak any of it aloud. "The men who attacked Ren Hollow," Draven said slowly, once the silence had stretched long enough that Alira began to wonder if he intended to say anything at all. "Do you know who led them?" Alira shook her head. "I never learned a name. Only that they came from within our own territory, from a faction that had grown resentful of Isolde's rule for years before that night. Whoever led them wanted Kale specifically, not the rest of the pack, not the land, just him. For his bloodline. For the strength they believed it promised," Alira confirmed. "The old line of Ren Hollow was said to carry an inherited power that surfaces only rarely. once every few generations, and always in an heir, with those particular pale gold eyes. My family served that bloodline for 3 generations, and even we never saw that strength manifest in anyone until Kale was born. Draven leaned back slowly in his chair, his expression thoughtful, calculating, in the deliberate way Alira imagined he approached every decision that mattered. And you believe whoever took him 3.5 years ago is connected to whoever abandoned him in the Ashgrove ruins 3 months ago? I don't know, Alira admitted. I've had 3.5 years to imagine every possible explanation, and none of them bring me any comfort. But I know that a cub does not simply wander alone into a ruin and survive there for weeks or months without someone, at some point, having kept him alive long enough to reach that place. Someone had him, something happened, and then he ended up abandoned, feral, and unwilling to trust anyone who came near him. Draven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a small crack in the composed mask he had worn throughout the entire conversation, and Alira found herself watching that flicker of reaction with more attention than she meant to give it. There was something underneath the king's careful control, something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine anger on Kale's behalf, and she had not expected that from a man she had assumed, based on nothing but reputation and the fearsome stories servants whispered about him in the corridors, would view the entire situation as nothing more than a political inconvenience. You risked everything to come here, Draven said, his gaze steady on hers. A false name, a servant's position, 3 months of watching and waiting, without knowing whether you would ever get close enough to confirm the truth. If I had discovered you sooner, if my guards had questioned your identity before today, what would you have told me? Whatever kept me close enough to him to keep watching, Alira said honestly. There seemed little point in pretending otherwise now, not after everything else she had already confessed. I would have lied to you as many times as it took, my king, and I do not regret it, whatever punishment you decide that deserves. Something shifted in Draven's expression at that, a flicker of what might have been respect, layered beneath the sharp assessment he had been giving her since the moment they entered this room. He rose from his chair slowly and crossed to the window, looking out at the darkened hills beyond, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. I am not going to punish you for loving a child enough to lie for him, Draven said finally, his back still turned toward her. But I need you to understand what this means. If Kale truly carries the bloodline you describe, and if whoever took him 3.5 years ago is still searching for him, then his presence within Blackthorn territory puts my entire pack at risk of drawing their attention here. I have enemies enough of my own, without inheriting a war that began in a valley I have never even heard of. Alira's arms tightened protectively around Kale, who stirred faintly against her chest but did not wake. Then what happens to him? Draven turned back to face her, and in the dim firelight, his expression had settled into something unreadable, something that made her breath catch with uncertainty about whatever he was about to say next. That, he said quietly, is exactly the question I intend to spend tonight deciding. Draven did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his study long after Alira and Kale had been escorted to a private chamber under guard, one that he had personally ordered to be comfortable rather than a cell, though he was careful to make certain the guards positioned outside understood their duty was as much protection as it was watchfulness. He turned the story over in his mind again and again, searching for the gaps, the inconsistencies, the places where a carefully constructed lie might show its seams. He found none. That worried him more than if he had. At dawn, he summoned his closest advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Petra, who had served 3 generations of Ashford rulers, and had never once, in Draven's experience, allowed sentiment to cloud her counsel. She listened to the full account of the previous day's events without interruption, her expression giving away nothing until he had finished speaking. You intend to keep them both, Petra said, once he had finished. It was not quite a question. I have not decided anything yet. You have decided, Petra said, with the particular bluntness that made her invaluable and occasionally infuriating. I have served you long enough to recognize the look on your face when your mind is already made up, and you are simply waiting for someone to argue you out of it. Very well. I will argue. Draven gestured for her to continue, settling back into his chair with the resigned patience of a man who had heard this particular tone from her many times before. The Cub's bloodline, if the Omega's account is accurate, carries a power that has already drawn one violent attack against an entire pack, Petra said. If word spreads that Blackthorn Keep now shelters that same bloodline, we invite the same danger onto our own territory. We have enemies enough already circling our borders, without adding a war that was never ours to begin with. And if I turn them away, Draven said, and word spreads instead that the Alpha King of Blackthorn abandoned a starving cub, and the Omega, who risked everything to protect him, what does that cost my reputation among the packs who still question whether Blackthorn rule can be trusted to protect the vulnerable, rather than only the powerful? Petra's mouth thinned into a tight line, because she had clearly already considered that angle and disliked it exactly as much as he expected. There is also the matter of the Omega herself, she said instead. A false name, a fabricated history, 3 months embedded within your household under deception. Whatever her intentions toward the cub, she deceived you and every servant in this keep to accomplish it. That is not a small thing to overlook, my king, whatever sympathy her story earns her. Draven considered that in silence for a long moment, because it was, he had to admit, a fair point, and one he had already turned over in his own mind more than once during the sleepless hours of the night. She lied to protect a child she believed she had failed once already, he said finally. I find I cannot fault her for that particular deception, as harshly as you seem to want me to. You find you cannot fault her, Petra repeated, and something in her tone made Draven glance up sharply, catching the faint knowing look in his advisor's eyes, before she smoothed it carefully away. Of course, my king. My apologies. I misjudged the nature of your interest. There is no interest beyond the security of this keep, Draven said, more firmly than the moment strictly required, and Petra's expression remained carefully, diplomatically blank in response, though he suspected she believed him about as much as he believed himself. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the study door, and a guard entered at Draven's command, his expression tight with the particular urgency reserved for news that could not wait. My king, forgive the intrusion. A rider has arrived at the outer gate, requesting immediate audience. He claims to represent Lord Garrick of the Eastern Territories, and he says his business concerns the cub currently held within these walls. Draven felt the entire room go still around him, felt Petra's sharp gaze snap toward his with unspoken alarm. Word of yesterday's chaos in the courtyard had barely had time to settle within Blackthorn's own walls, and already, somehow, a rider from a distant eastern lord had arrived asking specifically about Kale. Bring him to the outer hall, Draven said, rising from his chair with a slow, deliberate calm that gave away nothing of the sharp unease, now coiling tight in his chest, and send word to double the guard around the Omega's quarters immediately, quietly. I do not want whoever sent this rider to know we consider his arrival significant. Petra was already moving toward the door, her earlier argument about political risk apparently set aside in favor of the more immediate concern now unfolding in front of them. You think this Garrick is connected to whoever attacked Wren Hollow 4 years ago? I think it is a very large coincidence for a rider to arrive requesting audience about a cub whose existence within these walls was only publicly confirmed yesterday afternoon, Draven said grimly, striding toward the door himself. And I have never trusted large coincidences. The outer hall, when Draven arrived, flanked by 4 of his most trusted guards, held a single visitor, waiting with the composed patience of a man accustomed to being received by rulers far more important than himself. He was tall and lean, dressed in traveling clothes of fine but understated make, with dark hair pulled back neatly and a courteous smile that did not, Draven noted immediately, reach his calculating eyes. Alpha King Draven, the visitor said, bowing with practiced precision. My name is Callum. I have the honor of serving as an envoy for Lord Garrick, ruler of the Eastern Territories, beyond the Ashgrove ruins. I apologize for the abruptness of my arrival, but the matter I bring is one my lord considered too urgent for the usual formalities of correspondence. Then state your business, Draven said, his tone giving away nothing of the tension coiled beneath his composed exterior. My lord has reason to believe that a young wolf cub currently residing within your keep may be the missing heir of a distant bloodline that Lord Garrick has taken a personal interest in locating, Callum said smoothly. The cub was, as I understand it, discovered abandoned in the Ashgrove ruins some months ago, territory that borders my lord's own lands quite closely. Lord Garrick wishes to offer his assistance in confirming the child's true identity, and, should the connection prove accurate, in arranging for his safe return to his rightful home. Draven kept his expression carefully neutral. though every instinct honed over years of ruling a territory surrounded by ambitious neighbors screamed a single warning at him. Your lord's concern for a stranger's missing heir seems remarkably generous, envoy. What interest does Lord Garrick have in a bloodline that, as far as I am aware, has no connection to his own territory or his own people? Callum's smile did not waver, though something flickered briefly behind his calculating eyes, there and gone, before Draven could name it with any certainty. My lord values the restoration of proper order wherever it has been disrupted, Alpha King. He considers it a matter of principle that lost children of noble bloodlines should be returned to those with the rightful authority and resources to care for them properly, rather than left to wander feral in the wilderness or be claimed by whoever happens to find them first. The implication in those last words landed exactly as sharply as Callum had clearly intended, a subtle suggestion that Draven's own claim to Cale's welfare might be viewed, by outside eyes, as opportunistic rather than protective. Draven felt Petra's tension beside him without needing to look at her, felt the careful diplomatic weight of a conversation that had shifted, within a single exchange, from a simple inquiry into something considerably more dangerous. I will consider your lord's offer, Draven said finally, his voice giving away nothing. And I will send a formal response through the appropriate channels once I have had time to verify the details you have presented. Until then, the cub remains under Blackthorn's protection, and I would advise your lord against any independent action regarding a child currently residing within my territory. Something hardened behind Callum's polished expression at that, a brief flash of genuine displeasure quickly smoothed back into diplomatic courtesy. Of course, Alpha King, I will relay your response exactly as given. He bowed again, precisely as formal as his first, and departed the hall with the same measured composure he had entered with, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension that lingered long after the outer doors closed behind him. He is lying, Petra said quietly, once the envoy's footsteps had faded from earshot. Whatever interest this Lord Garrick has in the cub, it has nothing to do with restoring proper order to a distant bloodline. No, Draven agreed, his gaze fixed on the closed doors with an expression that had gone cold and sharp with calculation. I suspect it has everything to do with the same power that burned an entire pack to the ground 4 years ago. And I suspect Lord Garrick is not going to accept my answer as final. Draven found Alira in the private chamber he had assigned her, sitting cross-legged on the floor, with Cale curled asleep in her lap, a plate of untouched food resting on the table beside her. She looked up sharply when the door opened, her body tensing with the particular alertness of someone who had spent years learning never to feel fully safe, even behind locked doors. My king, she said, beginning to rise, careful not to jostle the sleeping cub. Stay seated, Draven said, closing the door behind him, and crossing the room to sit in the chair opposite her, close enough that he could see the faint shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the tension still held tight in her shoulders, despite the relative safety of the room around her. We had a visitor this morning, an envoy from a lord named Garrick, ruling territory in the east, near the Ashgrove ruins, requesting the return of a missing heir he believes may be residing within these walls. Alira's face went pale, her arms tightening instinctively around Cale, who stirred faintly, but did not wake. Garrick, she repeated, the name clearly meaning something to her, though not, Draven noted, anything she seemed to have expected. I don't know that name. I never heard it mentioned in connection to Wren Hollow, not once in 4 years of searching. Then either your searching missed something significant, Draven said, or this Garrick learned of Cale's existence far more recently than 4 years ago, likely within the last 3 months, since the moment scouts confirmed a feral cub had been found in territory bordering his own lands. Alira absorbed that in silence for a moment, her mind clearly working through the implications with the same sharp calculation Draven had spent the entire morning applying to the problem himself. You think whoever kept him during those missing 3.5 years is connected to Garrick. That Garrick did not simply hear rumors of an abandoned cub and take a passing interest. That he already knew, somehow, exactly what Cale was worth. It is the explanation that fits most cleanly, Draven agreed. Though I have learned, in 12 years of rule, that the explanation which fits most cleanly is not always the correct one. He studied her carefully for a long moment before continuing. I refused his request. The cub remains under Blackthorn protection for now. But I do not believe Garrick will accept that answer quietly, And I need you to tell me anything else you can remember, anything at all, from the months before Kale was taken from you, that might explain why a lord you have never heard of would suddenly take such a personal interest in his bloodline." Illyra closed her eyes, clearly forcing herself back through memories she had spent years trying to bury, and Draven watched the visible cost of that effort play across her features, with something that felt uncomfortably close to sympathy, an emotion he was not accustomed to extending so readily towards someone he had known for less than a full day. "There were rumors," she said finally, slowly, as though pulling each word up from somewhere deep and painful. "In the weeks before the attack on Wren Hollow, my mother mentioned overhearing conversations among the pack elders about outside interest in Isolde's bloodline, someone asking questions through intermediaries about the old power said to run through the family line. I was young, and I did not think much of it at the time. Pack politics were not something anyone trusted me to understand fully. But now, thinking back on it, I wonder if those questions came from Garrick's people even then, years before the attack that destroyed everything. Which would mean he has been patient," Draven said grimly. "Patient enough to wait years for an opportunity, and patient enough to move carefully now, rather than risk an open confrontation he cannot yet win." "What does that mean for Kale?" Illyra asked, and the raw fear beneath the question was impossible to miss, despite her obvious effort to keep her voice steady. Draven considered his answer carefully before speaking, aware of the weight his next words would carry. "It means I will not be sending him anywhere, regardless of what formal channels Garrick attempts to pursue," he said finally. "But it also means Blackthorn Keep is no longer simply hosting a mystery. We are now, whether I intended it or not, standing directly in the path of whatever Garrick has spent years planning. I need to know I can trust you completely if we are going to protect him through whatever comes next." Illyra met his gaze steadily, something fierce and unwavering settling into her expression, despite the exhaustion still visible beneath it. "You can trust me with everything, except my own life, my king. I would give that gladly, if it meant keeping him safe." Draven felt something shift in his chest at those words, something he did not have time to examine properly, before a sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment, followed immediately by a guard's urgent voice. "My king, forgive the intrusion. There has been an incident in the Eastern Servants' Corridor. A stranger was found attempting to access the private chambers wing, claiming to be a new kitchen hand, but no one on staff recognizes him, and he fled the moment he was questioned." Draven was on his feet instantly, every trace of the quieter moment before vanishing beneath the sharp focus of immediate threat. "Which direction did he flee?" "Toward the eastern wall, my king. Guards are pursuing now, but he moved with unusual speed for someone claiming to be simple kitchen staff." Draven's jaw tightened, and he turned back to Illyra with a hard, decisive expression that left no room for argument. "Stay here. Bar the door once I leave, and do not open it for anyone except myself or Petra. I mean anyone." Illyra nodded once, already rising to secure the door as he had instructed, and Draven strode out into the corridor with his guards falling into formation around him, his mind already racing through the implications of a stranger attempting to reach the private chambers wing on the very same morning Garrick's envoy had arrived to inquire so pointedly about Kale's location. He found Bastion already directing a search of the eastern grounds when he arrived, guards fanning out across the walls and gardens in a coordinated sweep that spoke to years of training under exactly this kind of emergency. "Report," Draven demanded. "A servant caught him trying the door to the private chambers wing, my king, claiming he was new kitchen staff sent to deliver supplies," Bastion said, his expression tight with frustration. But nobody recognized him, and when questioned about which cook had sent him, he panicked and ran. "We nearly had him near the stable yard, but he cleared the eastern wall in a single jump that no ordinary man should have managed." "Which means he is not an ordinary man," Draven said grimly, his gaze sweeping across the walls surrounding his keep with sharp, calculating focus. "Double the guard on every entrance to the private chambers wing immediately. Nobody enters or exits without explicit clearance from myself or Petra directly, and send word to the border watch. If Garrick's people are already testing our defenses this openly, this will not be the last attempt they make." As his guards scattered to carry out his orders, Draven remained standing in the eastern courtyard for a long moment, staring toward the wall where the intruder had vanished, feeling the weight of a decision he had made only hours earlier, settling more heavily onto his shoulders with every passing minute. He had told himself the choice to protect Kale and Illyra was a matter of principle, of reputation, of the kind of justice a good king owed to the vulnerable within his reach. Standing here now, watching his guards scramble to secure a fortress that had never once, in 12 years of his rule, faced a threat this immediate and this personal, he found himself wondering exactly how much of that reasoning had been true, and how much of it had simply been the most convenient explanation he could offer himself for a choice his instincts had already made the moment he watched a starving cub go still in a frightened Omega's arms. Whatever the true reason, there was no retreating from it now. Garrick had made his first move, and Draven intended to make certain it would also be his last successful one. By nightfall, the intruder still had not been found, though the search had turned up one useful piece of evidence. A torn scrap of cloth caught on the eastern wall, dyed a deep green, unlike any color worn by Blackthorn's own staff. Petra examined it under lamplight in Draven's study, her sharp eyes narrowing with recognition. "This dye," she said slowly, "is expensive, and it is not common outside the Eastern Territories. I have seen cloth this exact shade only once before, worn by traders who came through here, claiming to represent merchant interests out of Garrick's lands." Draven took the scrap from her, turning it over in his fingers, his expression darkening further. So our uninvited guest was not simply testing our defenses on a whim. He was sent, and sent recently enough that he did not have time to disguise his origins as carefully as he should have. "Or he did not expect to be discovered at all," Petra said, which suggests either overconfidence on Garrick's part, or an assumption that he had allies already in place within these walls, who would ensure his man moved unnoticed. The word allies hung heavy in the air between them, and Draven felt a fresh wave of unease settle into his chest. A fortress the size of Blackthorn Keep employed hundreds of servants, guards, and staff, any number of whom might have been approached, bribed, or coerced into providing information or assistance to an outside interest, without the rest of the household ever suspecting a thing. "Begin a quiet review of staff records," Draven said. "Anyone hired within the last 6 months. Anyone with unexplained absences or unusual patterns of movement through the keep. I want it done carefully, without alerting whoever might be watching that we suspect an inside connection." Petra nodded and departed to begin the work immediately, leaving Draven alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that Blackthorn Keep's problems had only just begun. He found himself, not for the first time that day, thinking of Illyra, and made the decision to check on her and Kale himself rather than send a guard, telling himself the choice was purely a matter of security, rather than anything more personal. He found her awake despite the late hour, sitting near the fire with Kale curled beside her, both of them watching the flickering flames with matching expressions of wary alertness that made something ache quietly in Draven's chest. She looked up when he entered, relief flickering briefly across her features before settling back into careful composure. "You found him," she said, though it was clear from his expression that the answer was no. "Not yet," Draven admitted, closing the door behind him and crossing to sit near the fire, close enough to feel its warmth without crowding the small space she and Kale occupied. "But we found evidence connecting him to Garrick's territory. I believe he had help reaching the private chambers wing, which means someone within these walls may be working against us." Illyra's expression tightened with fresh concern, her hand moving instinctively to rest against Kale's back, who had begun to stir at the tension in her posture even in his sleep. "Then he is not safe here either," she said quietly. "Nowhere is safe, is it? Not really. Not as long as someone out there wants him badly enough to keep trying." Draven studied her for a long moment, hearing the exhaustion beneath her words, the particular weariness of someone who had spent years running and hiding, and had, for one brief afternoon, allowed herself to believe that reaching Blackthorn Keep might finally mean safety, only to watch that hope crack within a single day. "I am not going to let him be taken again," Draven said, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that surprised even himself with its intensity. "Whatever it costs, whatever war it invites onto my borders, I made a choice yesterday, when I refused Garrick's envoy, and I do not intend to reverse it, because his people grow bold enough to test my walls." Illyra looked at him then, with an expression he could not quite read, something caught between disbelief and a fragile, tentative hope she seemed almost afraid to fully allow herself. "Why?" she asked softly. "You do not know me. You barely know him beyond a name, and a bloodline that could bring you nothing but trouble. Why would you risk your entire territory for either of us? Draven considered the question carefully, aware that whatever answer he gave now would matter more than he was entirely comfortable admitting to himself. Because I watched a dozen of my most trained guards fail to calm a frightened child through force, he said finally, and I watched a servant girl who had every reason to keep herself hidden step forward instead, risking everything she had built for herself, simply because she could not stand to watch him suffer a moment longer. That is not something I encounter often, Elira. Not in a court built on ambition and careful alliances. I find I am not willing to let people like Garrick destroy it simply because protecting it proves inconvenient. Something in Elira's expression softened at that. The careful walls she had maintained since the moment she arrived at Blackthorn Keep, cracking just slightly under the weight of words she had clearly not expected to hear from a king she had assumed, based on reputation alone, would view the entire situation through nothing but cold political calculation. Cale stirred fully awake between them then, his pale gold eyes blinking open, disoriented and still wary in the way of a creature who had learned, through hard experience, that waking often meant facing fresh danger. But when his gaze found Elira first, and then, cautiously, Draven's steady presence beside her, something in his small body relaxed by degrees, and he shifted closer to Elira's side without making a sound, watching Draven with careful, assessing eyes that seemed remarkably perceptive for a cub who had spent 3 months refusing to trust anyone at all. "He is studying you," Elira said quietly, a faint, surprised smile touching her lips for the first time since Draven had entered the room. "He does not do that with strangers. Not since I found him again." Draven held very still, meeting the cub's pale gold gaze with careful patience, resisting every instinct that told him to move, to speak, to do anything other than simply wait and let the small creature make his own assessment in his own time. After a long suspended moment, Cale shifted forward, just slightly, close enough that his small paw brushed against the edge of Draven's boot, a tentative, uncertain gesture that nonetheless carried unmistakable meaning. "I believe," Draven said quietly, careful not to break whatever fragile trust was forming in front of him, "that he has decided I am not a threat, at least for tonight." Elira watched the small exchange with an expression Draven could not fully name, something warm and cautious and hopeful all at once, and for a brief moment, the weight of Garrick's threat and the intruder still loose somewhere within Blackthorn's walls felt distant enough that the three of them simply sat together near the fire, watching the flames, allowing themselves a small, fragile stretch of peace before whatever came next arrived to demand their attention once more. That peace lasted only until a guard's urgent knock broke the quiet an hour later, delivering news that sent Draven's blood cold. The staff review Petra had ordered turned up an unexplained absence, a stable hand named Fenwick who had been hired only 2 months earlier, and who had not been seen by anyone since the previous night, the exact night the courtyard chaos with Cale had first begun. Draven ordered a full search of the stables within minutes, guards fanning out with lamps through the darkened rows of horse stalls and storage rooms, while he himself strode ahead with Bastion at his side. Every sense sharpened toward the possibility that Fenwick's disappearance meant something far more dangerous than a simple missing servant. They found the stable hand's small sleeping quarters empty, the narrow cot unmade, a few personal items scattered, as though someone had left in haste rather than through careful planning. But it was the loose floorboard beneath the cot that told the real story, pried up to reveal a small hollow space where a folded letter had been tucked away, apparently forgotten or abandoned in whatever hurry had driven Fenwick from the keep. Draven unfolded the letter carefully under lamplight, his expression darkening with every line as he read. It was brief, written in a careful, deliberately unremarkable hand, instructing the reader to report any activity concerning a cub matching a specific description directly to a contact waiting at a tavern in the border town, 3 days' ride east, with payment to follow upon confirmation of the cub's location and any weaknesses observed in the keep's security around him. "He was Garrick's man from the beginning," Bastion said grimly, reading over Draven's shoulder. "Planted here weeks before the cub was even found, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Which means Garrick has known about Cale's presence at Blackthorn far longer than his envoy's polite morning visit suggested," Draven said, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "This was never a courteous inquiry, Bastion. This was a confirmation visit. meant to gauge exactly how much resistance we would offer before he decided whether open action was worth the risk. And now that we've refused him, and now that his inside man has vanished rather than risk capture, Bastian said slowly, following the same grim logic Draven had already reached. He has everything he needs to justify moving forward with something far more direct. Draven folded the letter and tucked it into his coat, already turning back toward the main keep, with fresh urgency driving his stride. Double every patrol along the border. I want riders posted at every crossing within a day's journey of these walls, and I want Alira and Kale moved to the most secure chamber in this fortress, the one beneath the North Tower, with guards I trust personally stationed at every approach. The night stretched long and tense as Draven's orders were carried out, guards moving through the keep with grim efficiency, patrols riding out into the darkness along every border road, and Petra working through the small hours cross-referencing every scrap of information they had gathered against records of Garrick's known allies and movements. Draven himself barely slept, prowling the fortress corridors with restless energy, checking and rechecking every guard post, every locked door, every possible avenue an intruder might exploit. It was 2 hours before dawn when the attack came. A guard's shout echoed from the northern wall, followed almost immediately by the sharp clash of steel and the deep, furious howl of wolves shifting mid-combat. Draven was moving before the second shout finished, sprinting through the dark corridors toward the sound with his own wolf rising close beneath his skin, ready to break free the moment he needed it. He reached the northern courtyard to find chaos already unfolding, a group of at least 8 attackers in dark, unmarked clothing clashing with Blackthorn's night guard, moving with the coordinated precision of trained mercenaries rather than desperate opportunists. Draven's guards were holding their ground, but barely, and as he watched, 3 attackers broke away from the main fight entirely, sprinting not toward the gates or the treasury or anywhere a typical raid might target, but directly toward the North Tower, toward Alira and Kale. Draven's wolf tore free of his control almost before he consciously decided to shift, his body dropping into the massive dark form that had made him the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories, and he covered the distance to the North Tower in a handful of powerful strides, intercepting the 3 attackers just as they reached the base of the tower stairs. The fight that followed was brutal and fast. Draven's wolf form outmatched any single attacker easily, but 3 trained fighters working in coordination proved a genuine challenge even for him, and he took a deep gash along his shoulder from a blade one of them carried, silver-edged and clearly meant specifically for wounding a shifter in wolf form. He answered with a savage retaliation that left one attacker unconscious against the stone wall and sent the other 2 scrambling backward, suddenly reconsidering whatever payment had seemed worth this risk only moments earlier. More guards arrived then, drawn by the sound of fighting, and the 2 remaining attackers broke and fled toward the outer wall, rather than face reinforced numbers, disappearing into the darkness beyond the fortress with a speed that made pursuit difficult in the confusion of the ongoing battle in the main courtyard. Draven shifted back to his human form, breathing hard, blood running freely from the gash along his shoulder, and forced his way up the tower stairs 2 at a time despite the wound, his heart pounding with a fear sharper and more personal than anything the physical fight had summoned in him. He found the guards outside Alira's door still standing, bloodied but holding their position, having apparently fought off a separate small group that had attempted to breach the tower from a different approach, while the main assault drew attention elsewhere. Draven pushed past them and threw open the door, and the sight that greeted him made something in his chest unclench with relief, so sudden it nearly buckled his knees. Alira stood pressed against the far wall, a fire iron gripped tightly in both hands, positioned protectively in front of Kale, who had shifted into his wolf cub form and stood snarling beside her, with his hackles raised, despite his small size, ready to fight whatever came through that door alongside her. When she saw Draven, recognition and relief washed visibly across her face, though she did not immediately lower her improvised weapon. "They tried to come through the window," she said, her voice tight but steady. "2 of them. I fought them off with the fire iron until the guards outside heard the noise and broke in to help." Draven crossed the room in 3 strides, taking in the scattered signs of struggle, a shattered window frame, scorch marks where the fire iron had apparently caught someone across the face, and felt a fierce, unexpected surge of admiration cut through the lingering fear still coursing through his veins. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended, his eyes moving over her, searching for any sign of injury. "No," Illyra said, finally lowering the fire iron, as the adrenaline of the fight began to drain from her system, leaving visible tremors behind in its wake. "No, I'm fine." "But you're bleeding." "It will heal," Draven said dismissively, though the gash along his shoulder throbbed sharply with every movement. He turned his attention to Cale instead, who had not yet relaxed from his defensive stance, still watching the doorway with wary, alert eyes despite Draven's arrival. He fought. "He would not let them near me," Illyra said, something raw and proud breaking through the exhaustion in her voice, as she looked down at the small cub still positioned protectively at her side. 3.5 years of everything he suffered, and the moment danger came through that window, he did not hesitate for a single second. Draven knelt slowly, carefully, bringing himself down to Cale's level, with the same deliberate patience he had shown the previous evening, and this time, the cub did not retreat or growl, only watched him with steady, assessing eyes that seemed to carry far more understanding than any ordinary cub his age should have possessed. "You protected her," Draven said quietly. "Thank you." Something in the cub's posture shifted at those words, a subtle easing of tension that Illyra noticed immediately, her breath catching with quiet wonder as she watched Cale take one small, deliberate step toward Draven, close enough now that the king could have reached out and touched him if he chose. He did not, understanding instinctively that the choice needed to remain entirely Cale's own. Instead, he simply held still, letting the cub study him at whatever distance felt safe, and after a long moment, Cale pressed his small body briefly against Draven's outstretched knee, a gesture so fleeting it might have been accidental, except for the way Illyra's eyes filled with sudden tears at witnessing it. "He has never done that," she whispered. "Not with anyone but me, not once." Draven felt the weight of that small gesture settle into his chest with unexpected force, and he rose slowly, careful not to disturb whatever fragile trust had just taken root, his mind already turning back toward the practical urgency of the night's attack, even as something warmer and far more complicated lingered beneath his focus. "This changes everything," he said, his voice hardening again as the reality of the night's events reasserted itself. Garrick did not send a small scouting party hoping for a quiet extraction. He sent trained fighters carrying silver-edged weapons meant to wound shifters, willing to breach my walls in open combat, rather than continue with quiet infiltration. He is done being patient, Illyra. Whatever happens next, we are past the point of careful diplomacy. Illyra met his gaze steadily, the fire iron still gripped loosely in one hand. Cale pressed close against her leg once more, and in her expression, Draven saw the same fierce, unyielding resolve he had recognized in her from the very first moment she stepped forward in the courtyard, risking everything to reach a frightened cub nobody else could calm. "Then we stop being careful too," she said. "Whatever it takes, my king. I did not survive 4 years of running, just to lose him again now." Draven looked between the two of them, the Omega who had crossed an entire territory and buried her own identity, for the chance to protect a child not even bound to her by blood, and the small cub who had just fought silver-edged blades rather than abandon the one person who had never once given up on finding him, and felt the last of his earlier hesitation about the political cost of this fight burn away entirely, replaced by a certainty that settled deep and unshakable into his chest. "Then we do not stop," he said, "until Garrick understands, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what it costs a man to threaten what belongs under Blackthorn's protection." By mid-morning, Blackthorn's guards had captured one of the fallen attackers alive, the man Draven's wolf had knocked unconscious against the tower wall during the previous night's fighting. He woke chained in a lower chamber of the keep, disoriented and clearly unaccustomed to failure, his composure cracking rapidly under the combined pressure of Petra's sharp questioning and the unmistakable presence of an Alpha King whose patience had entirely run out. His name, he finally admitted, was a man called Roswin, a mercenary captain who had led the assault under contract to Lord Garrick, hired specifically for his experience fighting shifters and his willingness to work outside the usual boundaries of territorial law. Under Petra's relentless questioning and the growing understanding that his employer had clearly abandoned him to Blackthorn's mercy rather than risk further exposure attempting a rescue, Roswin's loyalty crumbled far faster than Draven had expected. Garrick did not simply learn of the cub 3 months ago, Roswin admitted, his voice hoarse, his eyes darting warily between Draven and the guards positioned around the chamber. He has known about the bloodline for years. It was Garrick's own agents who orchestrated the attack on Wren Hollow originally, working through a faction within the pack itself that had grown resentful of their ruler's gentle policies. Garrick funded the coup, promised power and territory to the faction leaders in exchange for delivering the cub once the pack fell. Elira, standing quietly near the chamber wall where Draven had permitted her to listen despite Petra's initial objection, felt the ground shift beneath her at those words. 4 years of assumptions about a random, opportunistic attack collapsing into the far more calculated truth of a plan built and funded by a man she had never even heard of until yesterday. Then why did they not simply keep him after taking Wren Hollow? Draven pressed, his voice hard and controlled despite the visible tension in his posture. Why abandon him, 3.5 years later, feral and starving, in the Ashgrove ruins? Roswin hesitated, and Petra took a single step closer, her expression promising consequences for silence far worse than whatever loyalty he still owed a man who had already abandoned him. The faction that took him, Roswin said finally, discovered they could not control the power his bloodline carried. It did not manifest the way they expected, not as something they could bend to their own use. Instead, it began manifesting as something violent, unpredictable, dangerous to anyone who tried to force it into shape too early, before the cub was old enough to properly control it himself. They kept him isolated for years, trying different methods to draw the power out safely, and every attempt only made him more feral, more resistant, more difficult to manage. Eventually, Garrick decided the risk of keeping him any longer outweighed the potential reward, and ordered him abandoned somewhere his origins could not be traced back to Garrick's own territory. Elira's hand rose to cover her mouth, horror washing through her in a cold wave, as she understood, finally, the true shape of what Cale had survived during the years she had spent searching for him. Not simple neglect, not simple captivity. Years of deliberate, calculated attempts to force something dangerous and unstable out of a child too young to understand what was happening to him, followed by abandonment the moment he became more trouble than he was worth. And now, Draven said, his voice dangerously quiet, Garrick has changed his mind again. Why send trained fighters to reclaim a cub he decided was too dangerous and unpredictable to keep barely 3 months ago? Roswin's expression turned genuinely uncertain then, the first sign that his knowledge had reached its limits. I only know what I was told for the contract, my king. That circumstances had changed, that the cub's value had increased significantly, and that Lord Garrick was willing to pay considerably more than the original bounty to reclaim him, alive if possible, but reclaimed regardless of cost. Circumstances had changed, Petra repeated slowly, exchanging a sharp glance with Draven that carried the weight of a shared, unspoken realization, meaning something happened within the last 3 months that made the cub suddenly worth pursuing again, despite Garrick previously deciding he was too dangerous to control. Draven's gaze shifted to Elira, and she felt the full weight of his attention settle on her with sudden, focused intensity. What happened 3 months ago? He asked quietly, besides scouts finding him in the Ashgrove ruins. Elira's mind raced backward through the timeline, searching for anything significant, anything that connected to the mystery unfolding in front of them, and slowly, a horrible possibility took shape in her thoughts. I arrived at Blackthorn Keep 3 months ago, she said slowly. Around the same time the scouts found him. If Garrick's people were still watching the border territories, even after abandoning Cale, if they recognized me, if they realized I was searching for him specifically, then they would have understood that whatever unstable power Cale carried might finally be reaching an age where it could be properly controlled, Draven finished grimly, and that you, someone who had cared for him since infancy, someone with an established bond he clearly still trusted, even after years apart, might be exactly the missing piece Garrick's earlier attempts had lacked. Not a threat to reclaim him from, a resource to reclaim him with. The implications settled over the chamber like a physical weight, and Elira felt sick with the sudden understanding that her own arrival at Blackthorn Keep, the very act of searching for Cale that had driven her for 3.5 years, might have been the exact trigger that convinced Garrick the cub was worth pursuing again. He does not want Cale alone, she said quietly, horror threading through every word. He wants both of us. He believes I can succeed where his own people failed, that I can help control whatever power Kale carries, and once that power is properly shaped, Garrick intends to use it, for whatever ambition drove him to fund the destruction of an entire pack in the first place. Draven's expression had gone cold and hard with fresh understanding, his gaze fixed on Roswin with an intensity that made the captured mercenary flinch despite his chains. "Is that the truth of it?" Draven demanded. "Does Garrick intend to take them both, not simply reclaim a bloodline, but weaponize a child's suffering for whatever ambition he is building toward?" Roswin's silence answered the question more clearly than any confession could have, and Draven turned away from him with barely controlled fury, striding toward the chamber door, with Petra falling into step beside him, already discussing logistics for securing the border, and formally responding to what now amounted to a declared act of war against Blackthorn territory. Illyra remained standing near the chamber wall for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of everything she had just learned, feeling 4 years of guilt and desperate searching reshape itself into something far larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She had spent so long believing that finding Kale again would mean the end of the nightmare that began the night Wren Hollow burned. Now she understood, with sickening clarity, that finding him again had only opened the door to something far worse. A war that Garrick had been patiently building toward for years, one that would not end simply because Blackthorn's walls had held against a single night's assault. She found Draven later that evening in his study, poring over territorial maps with Petra and Bastion, the three of them deep in urgent discussion about border defenses and diplomatic alliances that might be called upon should Garrick escalate the conflict further. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression softened despite the grim tension still gripping the room. "You should be resting," he said. "I could not," Illyra admitted, crossing to stand near the table where the maps were spread. "Not after everything Roswin confessed. I keep thinking about what he said, about Garrick believing I could succeed where his own people failed in controlling whatever power Kale carries. I need to know, my king, is that true? Is there truly some dangerous power inside him, something that could hurt people if it is not controlled properly?" Draven exchanged a glance with Petra before answering, his expression carefully measured. "The old records concerning Wren Hollow's bloodline are sparse, but what little exists suggests the power manifests as an amplified connection to instinct and strength, something that in a properly guided shifter could become an extraordinary asset, capable of feats far beyond an ordinary wolf's ability. In an untrained, traumatized child forced to manifest it before he was ready, without patience or proper guidance, it is entirely plausible that same power expressed itself as exactly the kind of feral, uncontrollable behavior Kale displayed when he was first found. Then it is not something dangerous in him," Illyra said slowly, understanding, dawning with a mixture of relief and fresh determination. "It is something that was made dangerous by how he was treated, by fear and force, instead of patience and trust." "That would be my assessment as well," Draven said quietly. Illyra straightened, something resolute settling into her expression as she looked between Draven, Petra, and Bastion, all three watching her, with the particular attention of people who had already begun to recognize that whatever quiet servant girl had first stepped forward in that chaotic courtyard, she was proving to be considerably more than anyone had initially assumed. "Then Garrick is wrong," she said firmly. "He believes I am the key to controlling Kale's power for his own purposes, but I do not intend to control anything. I intend to help Kale learn to trust it, to understand it, to grow into whatever strength it offers him, on his own terms, safely, without anyone forcing him into shapes he is not ready for. And if that means standing against everything Garrick built his entire plan around, then that is exactly what I will do." Draven studied her for a long moment, something like admiration and something considerably warmer than admiration alike passing behind his sharp eyes, before he finally nodded, a small, decisive gesture that carried the full weight of his agreement. "Then we build our defense around exactly that," he said. "Not fear, and not force. Patience and trust, and enough strength behind both to make certain Garrick never gets close enough to test either one again." 7 days passed in a tense, watchful quiet, Blackthorn's borders reinforced, and every patrol doubled, while Draven sent formal word to neighboring allied packs, informing them of Garrick's confirmed involvement in the destruction of Wren Hollow, and his ongoing pursuit of a child he intended to weaponize for his own ambitions. Several allies responded with pledges of support, unwilling to let a precedent stand where a lord could fund the slaughter of an entire pack and then pursue the sole surviving heir, with open violence, against another territory's walls. During those 7 days, something quietly remarkable also began unfolding within Blackthorn Keep itself. Draven made a point of visiting Alira and Kale each evening, not out of strict necessity, though he told himself that was the reason, but because he found himself genuinely drawn to the quiet hours spent near the fire, watching Kale's wary trust slowly deepen into something closer to comfortable familiarity. The cub began shifting between his wolf form and his small human form more frequently as the days passed, something Alira explained he had refused to do at all during his early months at the keep, too frightened and too disconnected from his own instincts to trust either shape fully. In his human form, he was a quiet, watchful boy of perhaps 4 years, with the same striking pale gold eyes, who spoke rarely but had begun, in fragments, to ask Alira small questions about his mother, about Wren Hollow, about the home he barely remembered losing. Alira answered each question with careful, gentle honesty, never hiding the painful truths, but never burdening him with more than his young mind could hold. And Draven found himself increasingly present for those quiet conversations, drawn into a small, fragile family unit, forming in the private chambers of his own fortress, in a way he had never once expected or planned for. On the 7th night, the peace shattered entirely. A rider arrived at full gallop just past midnight, nearly collapsing from exhaustion as he delivered his warning to the gatehouse guards. Garrick had assembled a force considerably larger than the mercenary band that had attempted the previous assault, drawing not just hired fighters but a portion of his own territory's trained soldiers, moving under cover of darkness toward Blackthorn's borders, with clear intent to breach the keep by open force rather than stealth. Draven convened his war council within minutes, the study filling with commanders and advisors, as maps were spread and defensive positions assigned, with the brisk efficiency of leaders who had trained for exactly this kind of crisis, even if they had hoped never to face it. Alira stood at the edge of the room, Kale pressed close against her side in his small human form, both of them watching the preparations with matching expressions of tense, focused determination, rather than the fear Draven might have expected. "They will reach our outer walls before dawn," Bastion reported, tracing a line across the map with grim precision. "Our allied reinforcements from the northern packs will not arrive until midday at the earliest. We will need to hold the walls alone for several hours at minimum." "Then we hold them," Draven said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a commander who had never once lost a defended position on his own territory. "Full guard rotation to the outer walls. Archers positioned along the eastern and northern towers where their approach will be most exposed. I want the gates reinforced, and every servant not directly involved in the defense moved to the deepest interior chambers immediately." As the room began to disperse, guards and commanders rushing to their assigned positions, Draven caught Alira's eye across the study and crossed to her directly, his expression softening only slightly from the hard focus he had maintained throughout the entire briefing. "You and Kale will be moved to the deep cellar chambers beneath the north tower," he said. "The most secure location in the entire keep, guarded by soldiers I trust absolutely. Whatever happens on the walls tonight, I need to know you are both safe." Alira shook her head immediately, something fierce and unyielding hardening in her expression. "I am not hiding in a cellar while you fight a war that exists because of us. I have fought before, my king. I can hold a defensive position, tend to wounded, do whatever is needed, rather than simply wait helplessly in the dark, wondering whether Garrick's forces have broken through." Draven studied her for a long moment, torn between the instinct to insist and the growing recognition, built over the past week of watching her strength, that arguing would accomplish nothing, except wasting precious time neither of them had to spare. "Then you will assist Leora with the wounded, positioned in the inner courtyard where you will have protection from at least 2 full guard rotations at all times," he said finally. "That is not a request, Alira. It is the only compromise I am willing to offer." "Agreed," Alira said, and something passed between them in that brief exchange that carried far more weight than the simple negotiation of a defensive position, an unspoken acknowledgement of exactly how much each of them had come to matter to the other over the course of one impossibly eventful week. Kale tugged at Alira's sleeve then, his pale gold eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, that looked strikingly familiar coming from a child so young. "I want to help too," he said, his voice small but steady. "I don't want to hide either." Draven knelt to meet the boy's eyes directly, his expression gentle despite the urgent tension gripping the entire fortress around them. "The bravest thing you can do tonight, Kale, is stay close to Alira, and trust the guards protecting you both to do their work. That is not hiding. That is allowing the people who love you to fight for you the way you fought for Alira in that tower. Do you understand?" Kale considered that for a long moment, with the unusually thoughtful seriousness he sometimes displayed, before finally nodding, small and solemn. "I understand," he said. "But if they get close, if anyone tries to hurt her, I won't hide then, I promise." Draven felt something tighten in his chest at that fierce, unwavering loyalty, and found he could not bring himself to argue against a promise that mirrored his own feelings so closely. "Then let us make certain it never comes to that," he said, rising and turning back toward the preparations, still unfolding urgently around them. The attack began just before dawn, exactly as the exhausted rider had warned. Garrick's forces emerged from the tree line surrounding Blackthorn's northern approach, in numbers that made even Bastion's experienced expression tighten with concern. Soldiers and mercenaries alike, moving in coordinated ranks toward the outer walls under the gray pre-dawn light. The battle that followed was fierce and costly. Blackthorn's archers took a heavy toll on the advancing forces from the towers, and the reinforced gates held far longer than Garrick's commanders had apparently anticipated. But the sheer numbers pressing against the walls eventually forced Draven to commit his own guard to direct combat along the northern approach, wolves and soldiers alike meeting the invading force in brutal, close-quarters fighting that spilled blood across ground that had known nothing but peace for over a decade. Draven fought at the center of it, his wolf form cutting through the ranks of attackers with devastating precision, driven by a fury that went far beyond simple territorial defense. He fought for the fortress that had sheltered generations of his people, and he fought, with an intensity that surprised even himself, for the small, fragile family that had taken shape within his walls over the course of a single remarkable week. The tide of battle hung uncertain for nearly 2 hours, Blackthorn's defenders holding their position through sheer determination, even as exhaustion and mounting casualties began to take their toll. It was in the midst of that grinding, uncertain fighting that a smaller group of Garrick's forces, exactly as Draven had feared, broke away from the main assault and moved with sharp, coordinated purpose toward the inner courtyard, where the wounded were being treated, where Alira worked alongside Leora, tending injuries, under the protection of 2 guard rotations that had already been stretched thin by the demands of the wider battle. Alira saw them coming before the guards did, a group of 6 fighters moving with grim, targeted intent directly toward the makeshift healing station, and she felt every instinct she had honed over 4 years of running and hiding snap instantly into sharp, focused clarity. She grabbed the nearest weapon available, a surgeon's blade, meant for far gentler purposes, and positioned herself directly between the attackers and the wounded soldiers under her care, shouting a warning that brought the courtyard guards spinning around, just in time to meet the assault. The fighting that followed was chaotic and brutal, guards falling back under the coordinated pressure of Garrick's specialized fighters, and for several terrifying moments, Alira genuinely believed the inner courtyard would fall, that everything she had fought so hard to protect would slip away in one final, desperate assault. Then Kale moved. He had been pressed against the courtyard wall exactly where Draven had positioned him, watching the fighting with wide, frightened eyes. But the moment he saw one of the attackers break through the guard line and lunge directly toward Alira with a blade raised, something shifted in him entirely. His small human form dissolved in a blur of motion, faster and more violent than any transformation his young age should have allowed, and he came out of the shift, not as the small starving cub who had once cowered on a stone well's edge, but as something larger, stronger, his pale gold eyes blazing with a fierce, ancient light that made every fighter in the courtyard freeze in startled recognition. The bloodline's power, suppressed and twisted by years of trauma and forced attempts to shape it before he was ready, finally surfaced in the one moment it mattered most, not through fear or force, but through love, through the desperate instinct to protect the one person who had never once given up on him. Kale's enlarged form crossed the distance to the attacker in a single powerful bound, and the fighter who had raised his blade against Alira found himself thrown backward with a force that no ordinary cub, however large, should have possessed. The remaining attackers, already unsettled by the sudden transformation, broke and scattered under the combined pressure of Kale's fierce defense and the courtyard guards rallying behind him, and within minutes, the assault on the inner courtyard had been entirely repelled. Word of the northern battle's turning point reached the courtyard shortly after, carried by an exhausted messenger, with news that allied reinforcements from the northern packs had arrived far earlier than expected, catching Garrick's remaining forces in a pincer that broke the back of the assault entirely. By full daylight, the surviving attackers were in full retreat, pursued only far enough to ensure they would not regroup, while Blackthorn's exhausted defenders began the grim work of tending wounds and counting the cost of a night that had tested every wall and every heart within the fortress. Alira found Kale in the courtyard afterward, shifted back to his small human form, sitting alone near the wall with his knees drawn up, and his expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and confused wonder at what his own body had just done. She crossed to him immediately, kneeling in front of him with tears she no longer bothered to hide, and pulled him into a fierce embrace that he returned with equal desperate intensity. "You saved me," she whispered against his hair. "I wasn't scared," Kale said quietly, his small voice muffled against her shoulder. "Not when it mattered. I just wanted to protect you, the way you always protected me." Draven found them there a short while later, his own body bearing the marks of a brutal night's fighting, his expression carrying an exhaustion that ran far deeper than physical fatigue alone. He knelt beside them both without a word, and Kale, without hesitation this time, without the careful wariness that had defined every previous interaction between them, reached out and pulled Draven into the embrace as well, small arms wrapping around as much of the king as he could manage to reach. "We won," Kale said, his voice small but certain. Draven looked over the boy's head at Alira, exhausted and tear-streaked and alive, and felt something settle deep and permanent into his chest, a certainty that had been building quietly all week beneath the urgency of war and threat, and finally, in this single quiet moment of survival, had nowhere left to hide. "Yes," he said softly, holding them both close amid the wreckage of a battle that had cost them dearly, but had, in the end, given him something he had never once expected to find within the walls of his own fortress. "We won." In the weeks that followed, Blackthorn Keep slowly returned to something resembling ordinary life, though nothing about the fortress felt quite the same as it had before the night Kale's cage door had first snapped open in the courtyard. The wounded healed, the walls were repaired, and word spread throughout the northern territories of Garrick's defeat and his subsequent loss of standing among his own allies, most of whom had quietly distanced themselves from a lord willing to fund the slaughter of an entire pack for the sake of a bloodline he ultimately proved unable to control or capture. Garrick himself retreated to his own territory, stripped of much of the influence he had spent years building, his ambitions toward Wren Hollow's bloodline permanently ended by the very public failure of his final, desperate assault against Blackthorn's walls. Draven made certain, through careful diplomatic pressure applied alongside his newly strengthened alliance with the northern packs, that Garrick would never again pose a credible threat to Kale's safety, a promise he intended to keep for as long as he held any influence at all. Alira remained at Blackthorn Keep, though she no longer served as a hidden servant carrying laundry through quiet corridors. Draven had formally acknowledged both her true identity and Kale's origins before the entire assembled household within days of the battle's end, declaring the boy under Blackthorn's permanent protection and inviting Alira to remain not as staff, but as an honored guest with full standing within his court, a position that carried with it privileges and respect she had not experienced since the peaceful days before Wren Hollow burned. She spent her mornings with Kale in the private gardens behind the keep, helping him practice the slow, patient control of his shifting abilities that Draven's own pack healers had begun teaching him, careful never to force anything before he felt ready, exactly as Alira had promised herself she would ensure from the moment she understood the truth of what he had suffered. His transformations grew steadier and more controlled with each passing week, the fierce power that had once manifested only through fear and trauma, slowly reshaping itself into something he could access with confidence and calm, drawn forward by patience rather than force. Draven found himself, more often than he had ever expected of a man who had ruled Blackthorn territory for 12 years, without once considering a mate, seeking out Alira's company for reasons that had nothing to do with political necessity or the lingering business of Garrick's defeat. He walked with her through the gardens some evenings, discussing nothing of particular importance, simply enjoying the quiet, easy companionship that had grown between them since that first chaotic afternoon in the courtyard. He found himself watching her interact with Cale, patient and gentle and fiercely protective all at once, and recognized, with the same clear certainty he brought to every important decision of his reign, that he had found something in her he had never expected to find at all. He asked her formally, 3 months after Garrick's defeat, on an evening when the northern hills beyond his study window had turned soft and golden with the last light of autumn, whether she would consider remaining at Blackthorn not simply as an honored guest, but as his chosen mate, bound to him, and to the pack he ruled for as long as they both should live. Elira, who had spent 4 years believing herself alone in the world, carrying grief and guilt and a desperate, unyielding hope that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, led her exactly here, said yes, without a single moment's hesitation. Their bonding ceremony took place beneath the same courtyard well, where Cale had once balanced so precariously on the edge of disaster, transformed now, with garlands and lanterns and the gathered warmth of an entire pack, celebrating a union that had begun in chaos and ended in something far more lasting. Cale stood at the front of the small gathering throughout the ceremony. Dressed in formal clothes he clearly found uncomfortable, his pale gold eyes bright with a joy that had been entirely absent from him the first time Alira had ever seen him, feral and terrified atop that same stone rim. When the formal vows concluded and the pack erupted into celebration around them, Draven knelt once more to Cale's level, exactly as he had on that first tense evening in his study, and extended a formal, careful invitation. "I would be honored," Draven said, "if you would consider Blackthorn your true home, and myself and Alira together as your family, for as long as you wish it to be so." Cale did not hesitate the way he once might have, all those months ago, when trust had felt like the most dangerous thing in the world to offer anyone. He simply stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Draven's neck, small and fierce and entirely certain, and Draven lifted him easily, settling the boy against his hip, while Alira watched with tears of pure, unguarded happiness streaming freely down her face. "I already do," Cale said simply. "You're my family already, both of you." The three of them stood together in the courtyard as the celebration continued around them, lanterns glowing warm against the deepening evening sky, and Alira found herself thinking, not for the first time, of the long and painful road that had brought her to exactly this moment. 4 years of running, of grief, of desperate searching through countless towns and territories, all of it leading finally to a single, impossible afternoon, when a starving feral cub had balanced on the edge of a well, and she had stepped forward without thinking, and spoken one single word that changed everything that came after. She had come to Blackthorn Keep, hiding behind a false name, certain that revealing her true identity would mean losing everything she had left to lose. Instead, that single moment of instinctive courage had given her back the child she had spent years mourning, had earned her the trust and eventually the love of a king who had proven himself far gentler and far more principled than his fearsome reputation had ever suggested, and had given all three of them a home and a family built not on the foundation of fear or force that had once nearly destroyed them, but on patience, trust, and a fierce, unbreakable loyalty that no enemy, however powerful, had proven capable of tearing apart. As the last light faded from the sky above Blackthorn Keep, and the sound of laughter and celebration echoed warm through the courtyard where their story had truly begun, Draven looked down at the small boy settled contentedly against his shoulder, and across at the woman who had risked everything for a single word of comfort, and understood, with a certainty that ran deeper than any political calculation or careful reasoning he had ever applied to matters of rule, that he had found, in the most unexpected chaos imaginable, exactly the family he had never known he was searching for. The guards who had once failed, one after another, to restrain a small and frightened cub, now stood among the celebrating crowd, raising their cups in honor of the very same boy they had once chased across a chaotic courtyard, and somewhere beneath the warmth and laughter of that evening, the quiet, unshakable truth of everything that had happened settled softly into place. It had taken a dozen trained soldiers, an entire fortress, and the full weight of a king's authority to fail, where a single whispered word, spoken by someone who had never stopped loving him, had succeeded completely. And in the years that followed, as Kale grew from a wary, wounded cub into a strong and steady young wolf under the patient guidance of the family who had refused to give up on him, the story of that first chaotic afternoon became a favorite told throughout Blackthorn territory, a reminder passed from one generation to the next that the fiercest strength in any pack was never found in force or command, but in the quiet, unbreakable power of a single word, spoken with love, at exactly the moment it was needed most.